What's up, alumni? Welcome to After 4, your podcast for navigating life after graduation. I'm your host and guide, John Steele. We're jumping into the final episode of this wellness series, and we're doing it by reintroducing a past guest. His name is Dr. Louis Tay. He's a professor in the Department of Psychological Sciences at Purdue University, and he's an expert in the area of well-being or optimal functioning. This area of study helps answer questions around living life well and finding fulfillment. And Dr. Tay is joining us for this episode to help us better understand and cultivate well-being in our own lives. The ideas he's going to share with us will greatly benefit your day-to-day wellness and your relationship with Jesus and others if implemented consistently. I'm really excited for you to get to learn from Dr. Tay if you didn't get a chance to tune in for this conversation's original airing back in 2023. So let's dive in. Here's Dr. Tay, and this one's for you, alumni. Hello, Dr. Tay. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I appreciate you having me.
I'm really glad that you're here. I wonder, for the sake of our conversation, may I call you Louis?
Yes, of course. Please do.
Thank you. Louis, I have to know, how's Indiana?
It's great.
I'm from Indiana originally. And so it's always, yes, I'm from Warsaw, not too far from where you are. And it's always nice to get to connect with someone on the podcast who's from the area. It almost feels like a vicarious visit home in some way.
That's awesome.
Well, Louis, I'm really glad that you're here today. Before we jump into our conversation around well-being, would you just give us a really quick introduction?
Yeah, sure. So I grew up in Singapore, pursued a PhD in organizational psychology, ended up working a lot on the topic of well-being, and somehow ended up here in the middle of Indiana amidst the cornfields.
Yes.
God works in mysterious ways. So I've been a professor here at Purdue for 10 years now. I love my job. I get to teach about well-being and also research well-being too.
So cool. I'm really looking forward to getting to dig into this wealth of knowledge, this many years of your own education and your own research and teaching others around the idea of well-being. So, Louis, I think when we hear the term well-being, it feels like something that you think you know, or at least that I think I know what that is, but then I might have trouble actually putting it into words. And I do remember from my days of psych research that it is always crucial to have an operational definition when you're trying to measure or explain something. So for all of our sakes, can you just help us continue to develop a working definition of what well-being is? What do you mean when you talk about well-being?
Yeah, I think a lot of people think of well-being colloquially as, feeling good.
Okay.
That's certainly a very important component, but I think that's also perhaps a very narrow version of it. One broader way of thinking about well-being is really optimal functioning.
Okay.
So think about it as two aspects, one in a classical Aristotelian sense of virtue or excellence. So doing good, if I were to kind of rephrase that, not only doing good, but also feeling good as well. In our day and age where we are more focused on emotions,
Yes.
And rightly so, the sense of feeling good. So I think it may still be a little bit abstract, but, one way of anchoring it is to kind of think about the different life domains like health, relationships, family, finances. Are you able to flourish in terms of doing good and feeling good about each of these life domains? And of course, as a Christian too, I think there's a deeper and more profound sense of what well-being is. I personally believe that it's really about loving God and having godly loves. We know the great commandment, loving God and loving others.
Yes.
And so God often has, amazingly how humble our Lord is, has others on his mind. And I think that is the posture that we would have, to be thinking about others and not merely ourselves. But at the same time, be able to also take care of ourselves. It's not at the expense of ourselves or the neglect of ourselves, because we need to love others as we love ourselves.
Yes.
And so I think there is a self-care involved, but I think there is going to be a predominant focus on others and how you can love others well. and how you can love the Lord well through that. I mean, it is a perennial question for human beings. Anybody who has lived for any amount of time asks the question, how do I live my life well? And what does it mean to have a fulfilling life, right? So that's one of the core questions that we have. And of course, as Christians, the Bible answers it in a specific way, but many people are pursuing many different ways of achieving that, whether they acknowledge it explicitly or it's just implicit in what they do.
That's a really helpful kind of starting place for us as we then move into what I'm hoping will be even more practical tools and understanding for our alumni listeners. And so for the rest of our time, I'd really like to start digging into well-being from a few different perspectives. But I'm wondering, based on the research that you're familiar with and that you're doing yourself, what are some of the biggest factors that you're seeing at play that today are actually hindering people's well-being?
So I think that just from a prevalence standpoint, and also kind of what I observe in the Christian church, I think one of the issues from the negative side is really kind of dealing with the issues of perhaps addictions. Sometimes we think, addictions, it's, pornography, alcohol, and gambling, but it can even be more subtle, like social media.
Yes.
Even more positive, like work. I think they promise quick happiness, but the funny thing is that they rob us of ultimate satisfaction, because you spend so much of your energies, efforts, and time to quote unquote get the dopamine fix. But then that quickly fades. And so you kind of get back on a treadmill and you keep doing the same thing, but you're in the same place. So I think that's perhaps one of the things that I personally have observed. And I think from the research standpoint, there's been a lot of work looking at developing deep and meaningful relationships.
Okay.
I think one of the challenges now in society is that we often coast superficial relationships. And we're not able to actually build and maintain these deeper relationships. In fact, it's been said that loneliness is now one of the biggest epidemics.
Wow.
And in the UK, they actually have a minister for loneliness to address this issue.
Really?
Yes.
Wow.
And a lot of that is occurring in young individuals. And so perhaps many of your listeners will relate to that. And so I think that's another challenging area, because even if you think about, psychological needs, relationships is really core. But I think one of the challenges that we have is that we're living in a culture that values convenience and values the ability to do whatever you want, whenever you want. And relationships often hinder that.
Yes.
Right? If you have a good friend, you guys are deciding, hey, what do we want to do? It's not always your way.
No.
You kind of need to figure out how do we kind of get along in order to do something that we both enjoy. And sometimes that might not actually happen. And so then you have to kind of give in or give way.
I think that is fascinating. You talk about that even relationship can be a quote unquote hindrance to our quick fix culture that we live in. I experienced this just the other day. For the last few months, my 5-year-old has wanted to go grocery shopping with me every Saturday. Every Saturday, she wants to come with me. And we have a whole mix of experiences when we do this together. It takes a lot longer. You are pausing to look and touch and investigate and explain all these different things and quiet down conversations that are wanting to be started about the people around you. All of these different things that make for a very different experience. Well, this Saturday, she wanted to stay home when I went grocery shopping. And so I had this mix of emotions of like, this is going to be so simple, but who's going to help me scan my food items? And so I had this really interesting juxtaposition of recent experiences of I was able to go fast and be more efficient in my grocery shopping, but it was far less entertaining, far less interpersonal. But just as you're talking about these things, I'm like, I have had a very recent experience with that. And I can identify some of the tension that you experience in both of those opportunities.
God just loves throwing in additional degrees of freedom in your life. You have to give up comfort, convenience, and control when you are in these types of relationships, because again, it's not about you. It's about building those relationships. It's about growing together.
Yes.
And it is challenging. At the same time, it is so fulfilling and so deeply nourishing. We are made for these types of relationships. And research shows that it only takes a few close, deep, meaningful relationships to fulfill that. You don't need thousands of followers. It takes a prolonged period of time to get to know somebody well. And I think one practical question to ask ourselves is, if I were to be in an accident, are there two people you can call who you know will drop everything and be with you? Do you have that support? And are you willing to do that for somebody else as well? So I think that's a question for us.
Yes. Are there places of overlap that you can see of like, wow, this is the stuff that well-being research says is good for us, and this is actually confirmed and has been long-standing in ancient faith practices, in spiritual disciplines?
Yeah, carrying along the line of relationships, there has been, over the last 5-10 years, a lot of more work on pro-social giving. This idea of spending money on ourselves versus spending it on others. And this ties into kind of, traditions of being generous, tithing and all of that, right?
Yes.
And the research shows that when you spend money on others, you're actually happier than if you were to spend it on yourself.
Wow.
And researchers are kind of digging into kind of why that's the case. I think one is, when you spend on others, often you are, for instance, buying coffee for somebody, you are able to build and deepen a connection. And I think at base as well, you are perhaps using that as a forcing function to not only think about yourself and your needs, but kind of go beyond yourself. And I think in some ways that allows us to free ourselves from the tyranny of our own fears and our own desires to think about others. And, we talked about loving God and loving others, right? So I think that there's something about that frees us. And so it's amazing to see kind of that overlap there. So I think that's one. I think the other area of interest is in mindfulness meditation. It's really this idea of, non-judgmental attention to the present moment. Often the practice of it is, focus on breath and bodily sensations to really center oneself to be in the moment. I actually think that, in the hustle and bustle of life, we often as Christians need to practice some version of that mindfulness meditation, because we need to even prepare our hearts to listen to the Lord. As the Bible says, be still and know that I am God. And if you've even tried it for any amount of time, even 1 minute, you just realize how many intrusive thoughts we have.
Yes.
What I'm going to eat for lunch? What do I want to do later? Or I worry about this. And I think just being able to center ourselves, to prepare ourselves to listen to God, I think that's important. I mean, what perhaps is more closely tied with kind of the Christian practice is Lectio Divina. As you know, it's really about, monastic practice of meditating on scripture and interacting with the Lord through thinking about scripture over and over again. And I think that that is related to, greater levels of well-being as well. Just being able to center ourselves on the truths of what God says. So mindfulness meditation, there's work showing that it does help with improving well-being. I think that as Christians, and if we do practice some of these meditative practices, it does help center us, and it helps us to also experience greater joy and greater levels of wellness.
Maybe I'm just making this up in my own head, but I continue to see these threads from other parts of our conversation. And that's, as we talk about the inconvenience of relationship, that it slows us down, yes. that feels like a part of our need for these meditative and reflective practices as we prepare for spending time with God. And that can be very frustrating because of all of these intrusive thoughts that we have. And in part, it's because we are welcoming another person into the situation with us. That as we sit down with God, we are forced to slow down and to move in step with him, just like we are when we call up our friend and say, hey, what movie do you want to go see this weekend? and you're sitting there talking about like, oh gosh, there's really this one that I want to see. And I'm thinking about how much it's going to cost if we can go to a matinee versus a late showing. And all of these sort of intrusive moments that could detract from your planning, but that are also part of slowing down to walk in step with your friend and to make plans. And that feels like that's part of why we can get so easily frustrated as when we sit down and try to spend time with God. And that we can just say like, nothing happens. Like all I do is just sit there and I think about this and I think about that. And I don't feel like I'm making any progress with God. And it almost feels like a place to normalize that and say like, yeah, that is part of like developing a relationship with anyone, including God, especially God, because we are trying to slow ourselves down and quiet our minds and walk in step and build a relationship, which takes time.
Yes, definitely. And I love that observation about, stilling ourselves as we are kind of in that relationship. There's also another thing that I have students do as well in my Science of Wellbeing class, and another practice, which is active listening. And being in a relationship requires that listening, and not just listening, but listening well. And in order to listen well, it is often a posture of really tracking what somebody is saying, rather than, at the back of our minds, sometimes this occurs, right? We all have that, like, okay, when is this person going to be done? I can't wait to get to my next meeting, or I want to do X, Y, and Z. And we all encounter that. But the art of listening well is to be able to say, no, I'm not going to be listening to these intrusive thoughts that I'm having, but I'm going to be fully present to you, John, because we're having a conversation, or I'm going to be fully present to you, God, because you're present here and I want to listen to you. So yeah, there's something about that too that all ties into this kind of relationship and relationship building.
Yes. It's just fascinating to me to slow down and to think through these relationships and the interplay. Are there other places of overlap that you see as you continue to live in this world of well-being, and as we think about what it looks like to be growing disciples of Jesus?
Yeah. So, a few years back, we were also very curious about figuring out, what are kind of levels of income that are needed for people to be happy.
Okay.
And we are seeing that there is a level of income satiation, meaning that beyond a certain point, income doesn't do much for happiness. Again, many of us work or we find jobs because we want to have a certain standard of living, or we're pursuing, income for not necessarily even for its own purpose, but, for other reasons. But income can only buy happiness to a certain point. And of course, some people ask, what is that level of income?
Right.
And it ranges, from, $60,000 to $95,000, depending on what aspect of well-being you're talking about, whether it's life satisfaction or it's emotions, but certainly around that range, I think. So I think that if we are continually hankering for more and more money, I think that it is important as well to pause. Of course, the Bible does say, right? It's not money that is, the root of all evil, but the love of money that is the root of all evil. And there's a lot out there, especially for young people these days, where it's like, hey, earn more money. You'll be happier, right?
Right.
I think it's important to pause and to really kind of think about that, because the research also points to the fact that it doesn't actually, on average, make you happier. In fact, it could make you more miserable.
Which then ties into what you were talking about earlier. This pro-social giving has a very positive impact on people's well-being. So that if you have this understanding of my financial development only has a certain amount of benefit to me and my well-being and my outlook on life, but anything above and beyond that, if that's also something that I consider as part of this pro-social giving, of investing in others, alumni investing in their chapter account, giving at church, buying coffee for a friend, that you could sort of bundle well-being in these different ways, your understanding of your finances could have a really significant impact on your thoughtfulness around giving and the impact that also has on your well-being.
Definitely. Jesus came to give us life and to give us life abundantly. Obviously, that doesn't mean that we won't have any suffering or misery or challenges in this life. But I think being thoughtful, like what you said about how we spend our resources in kind of giving to others, does actually fill us with joy. And kind of that's what the research points to. The other aspect about how we spend our money too is that research is pointing to the fact that material purchases don't buy us as much happiness as compared to buying experiences.
Interesting.
Spending time with somebody or going on a vacation with a family, those types of experiential purchases, as it were, are things that we can go back to continually. We can savor it. Purchasing the latest iPhone, well, unfortunately, sorry, it's going to be outdated, right? So
yes.
The amount of happiness you can derive from that is much lower. So I would say as well, if you do have discretionary income, think about ways of spending it on others, but also ways that you can spend it so that you can create joint experiences that you all can relish together.
Yes. You're investing in something that lasts, a memory that you can return to. It doesn't wear out like your iPhone will, but it's something that it gets cemented and stays with you. And you keep going back to that for the rest of your life. These memories that I have going on vacation with my family as a kid, like, oh gosh, I still cherish those today, but I have thrown away so many phones. But it also is an investment in relationship and has these additional benefits. Louis, the next question that I have is related to pursuing well-being in our personal lives. Do you have other thoughts related to that?
Yeah, I would like to speak to that a little bit. I think, we talked a little bit about this idea of self-care early on in our conversation. I think that physical and spiritual health is really often at the core of having kind of ability to even pursue well-being and pursue happiness and serve others. So those as well have an important place in our lives.
Okay.
So being able to have the spiritual practice of really listening to the Lord each day, making time for others, as I mentioned, and then also exercise and sleep.
Yes.
Those are things that we often neglect, but there is so much research showing that if you don't sleep well, if you don't eat well, if you don't exercise, you are not going to be as happy as you would be. And we often don't think about that. Or perhaps we kind of downplay that because, that's not spiritual. I want to think about these other things that are more quote unquote spiritual. But I think it's so vital to care for ourselves in those ways and be very deliberate. And I think that you will actually experience much higher levels of well-being just by being able to take care of your spiritual and physical health.
I mean, that makes so much sense to me just simply because it seems like in every aspect of research, whether you're talking about mental health or physical health or whatever it is, that some of these things that you talk about, those feel like some of the pillars of health that come up again and again and again. Are you having issues in fill in the blank area? Well, how's your sleep and how's your diet? And are you exercising? Yes. Like those are three things that you can implement in almost any situation where things are just feeling a little off kilter, and that might have a significant impact, or more than likely, if you are deficient in one or more of those areas, that it will have a significant impact on fill in the blank issue that you're experiencing. And as I think about our young alumni listeners who are moving into new spaces and new experiences, it feels like this is sort of a linchpin opportunity for them of what are the practices that you're going to establish in this new place from the beginning. You might have this new job, and so you know what your kind of 9 to 5 is going to look like 5 days a week. For other people, your schedules will look different, speaking generally. But then all of this other time, how are you going to start in this new place? What are the rhythms that you're going to establish? Getting enough sleep, eating well, and incorporating exercise. And that's not to forget the practices that we've already talked about of what does it look like to pursue relationship? What does it look like for continuing to pursue relationship not only with people, but with God, and to establish these things as part of healthy rhythms that will promote a healthy sense of well-being.
Mm-hmm. I couldn't agree more.
Well, Lewis, we've covered a number of fascinating topics that you can start applying these things right away. But I also want to give space for one final question here, a question I ask all of our guests. And this can be specifically related to the content that we've been talking about today, or it can be related to your own life experience. But if you could connect with someone who's nearing or has just entered their new life after graduation context, what advice would you give them?
Yeah, kind of beyond what I've shared, I think it's having the right expectations. Most of life, when you come out of, college and university, you're like, oh, I see life going this way, or, things have to move a certain way and at this pace. Most of life, I would say, is a repetition and
yes,
invisible increments. And so you might not see progress daily. You might not see immediate quote unquote impact. As the saying goes, the days are long, but the years are short.
Yes.
So be patient and wait on the Lord and trust him to use this process. For some reason, God loves to use time to refine us. Think about, Moses in the desert. There's something about repeating daily the routines, whether it's, okay, I'm going to exercise again, because you can't just say I've exercised once this week, so I'm done for the month, right? It doesn't work that way.
Right.
You have to do it over and over and over and over again. Some people describe it as the grind.
Yes.
But really, I just think of it as repetition. Invite the Lord to that. I think sometimes people get antsy, or sometimes people want to kind of break out of that. But God uses that. And so I think that often students coming out of college, they have a rude awakening, like, oh, wow, this is life. I'm doing this over and over and over again.
Yes.
But that's how the Lord works in our life. And that's going to be the majority of our lives. We will have, ups and downs and so forth, but a lot of it is repetition. So be prepared for that. It's not going to be, just a constant carnival or roller coaster. It's a lot of it is going to be, doing the same thing over again.
Yes. I love that piece of advice, because we live in a world and in a culture where we have quick access to people's success stories, where, you look up somebody on YouTube and they show you their 1 second picture or 1 second video, 1 second a day of my physical transformation. And so you've watched like 3 to 4 minutes and somebody's transformed their whole body. And it's like, that took way more than 3 or 4 minutes. That's just my experience with it. But we are inundated with what feels like quick transformation, quick success. And the reality is for most of us, I love that it is repetition. It is dedication to doing things again and again and again and again, and seeing slow but steady progress with Jesus and in relationships with others and in the work that we're doing. And there will be plenty of backtracking that happens as well.
Yes, absolutely.
But it's the repetition that will serve us well through all of that. Those are wise words, Lewis. I appreciate them greatly. And those are good things for us to remember, especially as we step into a brand new context, that now's the time to establish healthy repetition. Thank you so much, Lewis. I know that you have plenty of things going on in life around you, and so I'm grateful for your investment here and investing in InterVarsity alumni. Thanks a lot for joining me today.
Not at all. Thanks for inviting me, and it's been a pleasure to be on the show.
I really appreciate the foundation Dr. Tay provides for well-being, loving God and having godly loves. What if that was our metric for the things that we engaged with? Does it help me love God or help express my love for Him? Is this a godly thing that I'm engaging with? It reminds me of Philippians 4:8, whatever is true, noble, right, pure, lovely, admirable. If anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. What if we used those biblical instructions as a roadmap for pursuing health and wellness in our lives? I think it might have a significant impact. On a related note, check out the show notes for links to a couple other conversations that I got to have back in 2023 with Jay Kim, the author of Analog Christian, Cultivating Contentment, Resilience, and Wisdom in the Digital Age. Jay has some extremely helpful insights for healthy practices and rhythms in a world where we're so inundated by overindulgence and unhealthy comparison. Just a couple extra resources as you think about wellness. Alumni, we're shifting focus for a few weeks before our next series starts up in mid-April. Next week, we're going to hang out with Philip Shigog, pro-acoustic duo Archive. Philip is going to share about his experience with the transition to life after graduation and how his time on campus with Arts InterVarsity through Juilliard Christian Fellowship has helped him lean into his calling in meaningful ways. Don't miss it. Until then, consider sharing this episode with someone who needs to hear it, and I will see you in the after, alumni. Thanks for listening to After 4. This podcast is brought to you by the InterVarsity Alumni Relations Team, hosted and produced by John Steele, production assistance by Mike Zentera, edited by Caleb Leppert, and our After 4 theme music was written and performed by John Steele.